Welcome to another episode of CNC Basecamp. Today we've got a fun little project. We're going to be using some purchased carving files to create some really unique, fun pencil boxes. We're going to work with stretching the files, we're going to use contrasting woods to really pull the image, and finally we'll use the files to create some very unique shaped boxes. So it's going to be fun. Stick around, join me on this episode of CNC Basecamp. This episode is sponsored by Inventables. Design it, build it, sell it. Learn more at inventables.com. Our first pencil box is going to be this really lovely oak leaf motif that you see here. The box itself is pretty simple. There's a bottom, which consists of a pocket cut to create the place for the pencils, and finally a profile cut for the overall shape. The lid is a little more complex because we have this raised area which locates the lid on the box. So we're going to be doing a two-sided cut on the top. We'll cut the bottom first to create the raised portion. Then we'll flip it over, making sure we index things correctly and begin the carving process. Our first step though is to start with the basic box. So I have a blank of wood set up here that's 1 inch thick. It's white oak. I'm using a straight bit because it gives me a very clean cut. So let me go ahead and get the machine going. We'll get the bottom cut out. Well, now it's time for us to cut the lid. As I mentioned earlier, the lid is cut on both sides. The first order of business is to go ahead and cut this raised portion of the lid, which will index into our box. So what you're going to see happen is this straight bit is going to go ahead and cut a ring to form this inner raised area. The straight bit is also going to drill 2 holes through the wood and into my spoil board. Those are our indexing holes, which will allow me to accurately flip it over and reposition the blank in the exact spot to begin the carving operation. Well, we're getting ready to start our carving operation. Now, the first thing I've done is to switch out the bits. We were using a 1/4 inch straight bit. I've switched out to a 1/8 inch bit with a roughing pass to define the features of our carving. Before I do that, I need to remove our blank and flip it over and make sure it's registered properly. So first thing, take out some screws. I just want to remove any burrs from the wood to make sure that it lays flat against our spoil board when I flip it over. Now, it really doesn't make any difference whether we flip it over edge for edge or end for end. It's still going to register correctly for what we need because it's symmetric. What I've got here is a couple of 1/4 inch dowels. I've chamfered one end to make sure they go in a little bit easier. I'll begin by tapping it through the oak. Find the magic spot here, and there we go. Second one's a little easier. Line it up. Drive it in. So now we know our part is exactly registered and ready for carving. Before I clamp everything down, I'm going to go ahead and trim off just a little bit of the excess dowel. And I want to make sure that everything is firm and secure, so I'm going to put my cleats back on. All right, with the wood in place, I need to re-zero the Z-axis of my bit. If you want to feel foolish, forget to do that and start running your routine. And there we go. Well, we finished up with our roughing pass using a 1/8 inch straight bit. I've changed bits and now we have a 1/16 inch tapered ball nose bit. Ball nose bits are what we use for the final pass to get a nice smooth finish. The tapered design of this bit makes it rugged, so it's really a great performer. One of the parameters that we have to set with any of these bits, whether it's a roughing pass or a finishing pass, is the amount of step over with each pass. Now with the roughing bit, I went ahead and set about a 38% step over. So in other words, 38% of the diameter each time it's taking off of the material. And that way we can get the job done pretty fast because after all, it's the roughing pass. For a finishing pass, we generally want to be around 12 to 18% for a step over. I've got this set at 12%, and that'll give a nice smooth finish. Another parameter when you go to set these up is the boundary for the carving. You can choose for the router bit to go to the full extent of your material or to a vector that you have placed on your work, or it will just simply route to the boundary of the purchased file that you have. In this case, for our box, I didn't want it to go to just the boundary of the purchased file, and I didn't need it to go to the material. So what I did was I simply drew a rectangle a little bit larger than our finished box, and I instructed the program to cut all the way out to that boundary box. And that way I get a nice clean break when we separate our carving from this motherboard for our box lid. The carving work is done. I've reinstalled our 1/4 inch straight bit, and I'm now going to separate out the lid from the parent stock. Well, our CNC work is done for the oak leafed box. As you see here, I have the lower portion of the box. I have the lid with the recess, which fits right in, and we've got the attractive leaf pattern on top. So what's left? Well, a bit of sanding and a trip to the finish room. Well, with our first box, the oak leaves, we worked with the carving file a little bit by condensing it and making it fit our box. One of the things you can do with any of these carving files is to stretch them, shrink them, and make them deeper or shallower. So there's a lot of versatility there, and you can really work with the file and make it sync up with what you're doing. This project is a little different, this tree box. In this case, what I'm trying to do is use 2 different woods and really make the design pop. So the tree is mostly out of cherry with the background out of maple. Now if you look at the CNC machine here, I have a laminated blank ready to cut with cherry on top and maple below. One of the challenges of using the 2 different types of wood for carving is to make sure that the carving and the background split at the right level. So take a look at this blank here. This is one I started of the tree, and I found out that I was cutting too deep. I was cutting away too much of the cherry, and I was really starting to lose a lot of the detail. So there's a little bit of trial and error involved, and you may need to tweak things a little bit to get the break between your 2 different woods at the right point so that your carving pops out but isn't lost. The balance of this box is very similar to the oak leaves. It's a solid body with a pocket cut for the interior and a profile cut for the exterior. The lid's a little different. Rather than having a raised portion to index the box, I wanted to take a simpler approach. So what I did was used rare earth magnets, which align with some simple number 5 wood screws. And it makes for a very simple, clean way of having the lid attached to the box. The bits that I used for carving the tree are an 1/8 inch straight bit for the rough out and a 1/16 ball nose tapered bit for our finishing pass. Another trick that's always good to mention is using a nylon bristle, or my favorite is a Palmera bristle brush, to get out some of the little fuzzies left over from the carving process. The brush also puts a nice burnish on everything and makes it look great. Our third project is one which I haven't made a sample of yet. It's going to be fun. It's in the shape of a fish. So I found a file on Design Make of a trout that I thought would really work well, and I downloaded that. So in VCarve Pro, I created all the different cutting files to make a top carved in the shape of the fish. So there's a roughing pass and a finishing pass, and finally a profile pass. And then of course we're going to make the lower portion, the box, in the same way we worked with the tree box and the oak leaves. There'll be a pocket cut to remove the material for the cavity, and then finally a profile cut. I think it should be fun. I'm also going to plan on using the rare earth magnets like I used with the tree box, so I don't have to do a double-sided cut with the top. Now right now I'm set up to begin with the pocket cut for the box itself. I have a 1/4 inch straight bit in place, so let's go and get started. Well, it's time to go ahead and cut the profile of our trout box. Now I kind of debated, should I use an 1/8 inch bit and get more of the detail of the outline of the trout, or should I use a 1/4 inch bit? And I ended up deciding on the 1/4 inch bit. I've done a lot of cutting with 1/8 inch bits, and the thing is, when you start getting fairly deep in the wood, they simply don't extricate the chips very well, and they tend to overheat quickly. And so it's a slow process. And frankly, for a pencil box, do I really need that detail? So I decided to go with a 1/4 inch bit. It's strong, it's rugged, and it does provide a pretty good sense of the outline of the fish, even though we lose just a little bit of the detail in the fins. Well, here is the bottom of our fish box. You can see the pocket for pencils and pens and the overall profile. So all I need to do is cut my tabs and get it cleaned up. In place is a blank for the top. We're going to start with our roughing pass to begin carving the fish, and I'm using a 1/4 inch bit to be kind of speedy and aggressive about the whole process. So let's get started. Time for the final pass on our fish box top. We've got an 1/8 inch tapered ball nose bit in the machine. 1/8 inch because it's pretty efficient. Now I'm using a 13% step over, just like I did with the 1/16 inch bits. And I think it's going to work out just fine for this design. It's not quite as fine in detail as those little oak leaves, so an 1/8 inch bit's the one to go with. Well, here's the fish lid to our box. What I'm doing now is smoothing out all the edges, getting rid of the tabs, and getting it blended so it'll fit nicely on top of our box bottom. After I do all that sanding and blending, I'll then go back in and mark locations for some rare earth magnets and screws to hold the top in place, just like we did for the tree box that you saw earlier. But I think this is going to be a really fun little pencil box. I love the shape. It's got a lot of character to it. So I'm eager to hurry up and get it done. Well, a number of years ago, I purchased a carving file for oak leaves and acorns. And it was originally sold for like a freeze panel above a fireplace, so fairly large. So I reduced it a little bit and had some fun with it, making this panel. Well, last year I decided, well, maybe I'll go a little bit smaller. And I created this little panel, thinking I might use it on a pencil box someday. I used a 1/16 inch bit for the roughing pass and a 32nd inch ball nose for the finishing pass. Well, recently I thought to myself, how small can we really go? So I went ahead and reduced this pattern down to 3.5 inches long by 1/2 inch tall. The bits that I used, one 32nd inch roughing bit, a 1/32 inch end mill, and the finishing bit, a 1/64 inch ball nose. Tiny bits. I use them in my DeWalt router here. I do have a precision chuck on it. All this was done using our homemade Woodsmith machine. So you can go pretty darn small with any of these patterns. Now, where would I use something like this? Well, what's come to mind to me is the scales of a pocket knife, the sides of a small woodworking square or adjustable bevel. I think there's actually a lot of applications out there for what we could call micro carvings. Now, you might not want to go with a 1/64 ball nose, but let's say you had a 1/16 inch end mill for your roughing cut and a 32nd inch ball mill. You can do a lot. So we tend to always think big in this world, but sometimes it's awful fun to think small. So think of all the great applications for micro carvings in your woodworking. When you're setting up your roughing and finishing cuts to do any type of carving work, you're given a choice between raster and offset cutting methods. The raster method typically starts at one end and just goes back and forth and progresses across your carving. You do have the option to set the raster at an angle. Now, very often what I like to do for roughing cuts is use the raster method at 45 degrees. It's a very efficient way of clearing all the waste. I don't often use the raster for a finishing cut because it can leave a slight fluting, slight marks that are visible to the eye across your carving. What I prefer for the finishing cut is to use the offset method, which just tracks back and forth. Over the majority of the carving, the bit will then be following the grain, and I just think it's less visible and produces a little bit better quality of a cut. But it depends on the material, it depends on the wood, and it's something for you to experiment with. So raster versus offset, it's one of the choices you have to make when you're setting up for carving work. This episode is sponsored by Inventables. Design it, build it, sell it. Learn more at inventables.com.